I'm Bill Anderson. I'm here to, I'm doing Say's Law and the Theory of the Business Cycle. I'm very, very glad to be able to be in a session with my Jewish mother, Walter Block, and hope it all works out. Before I do this, though, to sort of highlight what's going on in the rest of the world on the business cycle. It seems that our friends at the New York Times, now they're very, very good at giving advice to people, in fact, whole governments now. Now, we're talking about a newspaper that basically is on its way to bankruptcy and can't manage its own finances, but the rest of the world, but it does still give advice. But the reason I did this, is because it ties in with what I'm talking about here. If you think about the current way of thinking, and certainly what you hear on the news, in governments, of course, governments are always going to be, I think they're always going to be biased towards spending. Certain politicians are, but what the Times is saying is, look, these guys need to go out and spend more money. They're not spending enough, and they're not going to prop up the economy. And the whole issue is just spending. If we can just spend enough. And now this is ironic, because Japan struggles through a recession in the 1990s, constrained by weak government and an enormous pile of debt. And I'm thinking, what the hell do we have in this country? I think that's what we call it, an enormous pile of debt. But nonetheless, that's all right. That's not a constraint here, but it must be a constraint in Japan. And so, I look at that, and you wonder what it is that they're smoking, but then you've already figured it out. The world would be much better off to substantially increase fiscal spending at home, to provide financing for poor countries so they can do like us and get themselves some debt and spend more money. As Peter Schiff likes to say, to borrow money from foreign governments and blow it on consumption goods. And but they do argue against protectionism, but I'm sure that they'll get around changing that too. And I like this. In a recent speech, Christina Romer, another of President Obama's economic advisors, pointed out some lessons from the Great Depression. That fiscal stimulus works. It does. I had no idea. In a recent speech, let me see, and the more countries around the world do it, the better off we all will be. And Europe and Japan should listen, and so should Washington. So, at any rate, now why do I bring that up? Because I think that Jean-Baptiste, which he first wrote what we called Say's Law, not really Say's Law at all, but a law, but he wrote this back in 1803. So somebody back in 1803 actually had something to say about this whole mess. Something, also along that line, you'll notice I didn't have anything up there by Paul Krugman. It just kills me. He is off today. And so I was counting all week on putting some outrageous statement by Paul Krugman up there, and now the guy disappoints me and he's not there. I'm sure my Jewish mother would have something to say about that too. But at any rate, I want to go with it. What we've got, it's in Book 1, Chapter 15. And what Say does is he starts out describing what would be slow business conditions. What we might call recession. 1803, obviously, you don't have the business cycle like we have now, but you have slow times. So it says it's common to hear adventurers in different channels of industry assert that their difficulty lies not in the production, but in the disposal of commodities. 2 centuries later, Paul Krugman is saying that the difficulty lies not in the production, but in the disposal of commodities. That products always would be abundant if there were but a ready demand or a market for them. I put, when the demand for their commodities is slow, difficult, and productive of little advantage, they pronounce money to be scarce. The ground object of their desire is a consumption brisk enough to quicken sales and to keep up prices. Oh my gosh, I mean, you might, this is the New York Times editorial page. And where Mises in 1960 writes, whenever business was bad, the average merchant had two explanations at hand. The evil was caused by scarcity of money and by general overproduction. Adam Smith explodes the first of these, Say devotes a refutation of the second. And so what we've got really with when we talk Say's law, and why does it relate to the business cycle, is because the arguments that Say was making are very, very much apropos to what we're doing. Okay, and I want to go to a quote by Thomas Sowell and then come back to the rest of the material, explain how Say's law actually does relate to the Austrian business cycle. Say's law is not sufficient, or what he lays out in chapter 15 is not sufficient to explain the Austrian business cycle, but it is necessary. So it's a necessary but not sufficient passage. And Sowell writes, long before Engels and Marx came upon the scene, economists had divided into two main groups. Those who explained depression by inadequate demand, this is the general glut theory, led by Sismondi and and Malthus, and those who insisted that depressions were caused by internal disproportionalities in the composition of overall aggregate output. I hate that term, right? But too much of A and too little of B, rather than by its total being excessive relative to aggregate demand. Okay, and so then I take a passage from chapter 15 on page. I've got the book. Let me see. His edition from 1826, and this is where it comes out. But it may be asked, how does it happen that there are times when so great a glut of commodities in the markets and so much difficulty in finding vent for them? Why cannot one of the superabundant commodities be exchanged for another? I answer that the glut of a particular commodity arises from its having outrun the total demand for it in one of two ways, either because it has produced an excessive abundance or because the production of other commodities has fallen short. It is because the production of some commodities has declined that other commodities are superabundant. Now, another way to do that is what Peter Schiff has been saying. I know nobody in this room's ever heard of Peter Schiff, but he's a guy who appears on YouTube once in a while. And what he says is the fundamentals are out of balance. Now, we've all heard him say that. The fundamentals are out of balance. Well, basically, this guy's not Peter Schiff. He doesn't know about YouTube. He's dead. But he's saying the fundamentals are out of balance. And what we're really dealing with in the Austrian business cycle is that whether or not we talk about a monetary, inflation, which, by the way, I really like that previous paper because that really does bring some interesting issues. Because Rothbard, as you know, said simply that the presence of fractional reserve banking in and of itself will cause that. And what you're saying is that that's necessary but not sufficient. And so when you add the credit expansion in there, and if Rothbard we're disagreeing with you, why then wouldn't be able to argue anyway because he's also dead. But like Say, at least they left something. Unlike Keynes, who left something too, but it was not very good. But if we go to Say's law, and this is from an explanation from Tom Sowell's Classical Economics Reconsidered, the total factor payments received for producing given are necessary and sufficient to produce that volume of output, as opposed to the leakage, theory, okay? There is no loss of purchasing power in the economy, okay? No Keynesian leakages. People save only to the extent of their desire to invest and do not hold money beyond the transactions need during the current period. Of course, I like to point out that why do we save money? So we can consume in the future. I mean, even savings will be consumed, but, there's a purpose there. In the Keynesian business, it's not only do animal spirits guide the investors, but animal spirits guide the rest of us to stuff money in our mattress, which is always what savings is in the Keynesian view, and the Krugman view, of course. Investment is only an internal transfer, not a net reduction of aggregate demand. All right. In real terms, supply equals demand ex ante, since each individual produce only because of, to the extent of demand for other goods. In other words, the source of your demand, folks, is your supply. It's what you produce. That, in other words, and whereas what they're talking about with on the New York Times editorial, let's create some demand. Okay, we can do this. Yes, sir. And we'll now, okay, throw the money out there. We now have demand. We're going to be able to sell all those commodities. They're not going to sit in warehouses, by George. They're going into your homes. And a higher rate of savings will cause a higher rate of subsequent growth in aggregate output. Oh my gosh, it's it's an Austrian view, but it was a standard view held by economists pretty much until Mr. Keynes came on the scene. And a few other people were called cranks, and then like Silvio Gesell, who wanted to issue a currency that timed out, and so Keynes called him a prophet. The disequilibrium in the economy can exist only because the internal proportions of output differ from the consumer's preferred mix, and because output is not excessive in the aggregate. This is very important. We are being told, ladies and gentlemen, that this current downturn is a problem in aggregate demand. We're just not spending enough. Now you got to have to spend more, get that. I want you to max out that credit card and then go get another one. But Benjamin Anderson wrote in 1949, prevailing view among economists has long been that purchasing power grows out of production. The great producing countries are the great consuming countries. The 20th century world consumed vastly more than the 18th century because it produces vastly more. Not just prints more money, Mr. Krugman. Supply and demand in the aggregate are not merely equal, but they are identical, since every commodity may be looked upon either as a supply of its own kind or as demand for other things. But this doctrine is subject to the great qualification that the proportions must be right. Okay, and again, what is the Austrian business cycle is in the proportional camp. The proportions are wrong. What do we mean by malinvestment? What we're saying is that the malinvestments, especially with the injection of credit, and also more money goes into capital goods, but people's spending do not match the intertemporal structure that is created. So you get a structure of production that is out of balance with the preferences of consumers. And so what happens is they begin to spend their money. They're trying to direct the balances, the economy back into balance. And what we've got right now is a government that says we can't allow that. I mean, if you want to know what the Obama stimulus program is, it basically is a declaration that we cannot go back to those old proportions because that's just morally unacceptable and politically unacceptable too, if you want to be. Okay, and then so let's go to Michael Harrington. Yes, remember Michael Harrington? He's also dead, and that's probably a good thing, and because he can't write anymore. And so, but I remember in 1981, he wrote this in the National Education Association's magazine, Education Today, which is a misnomer for them. It says, during the 30s, there was a glut of consumer goods because workers lacked the purchasing power to buy back. Oh, I like that one. What they produced. Oh, and that's why the government began to play a role in the economy on behalf of middle and low-income people during the period of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. Okay, in other words, what they're saying is that production and consumption are separate. They're unrelated things. You produce and maybe this stuff will kind of get sold. If the consumers have enough money, but however, because of the internal contradictions of capitalism, why then there's leakages from the system, they don't spend enough, and then we get this aggregate glut. I mean, that's the entire theory in a nutshell. And so, but what happens, as Rothbard points out, that once the new money comes into the system through an injection of credit, what occurs is that it ultimately ends up in the hands of people as income, and then they rush to establish the old proportions. In other words, not the proportions as being laid out in the structure that's given by the interest rates, by the credit structure, that, in other words, that says one set of signals, but the buyers are going out, they're buying goods, and they're setting another set of signals, and demand shifts back from the higher to the lower orders. And that goes all the way back to Menger and his 1871 book, Principles of Economics. And so, the favorite explanation of the crisis stems from underconsumption. Okay, that's what we have. That's what the New York Times editorial is about. Darn it, it's not just the individual consumers who are under-consuming, it's those governments. You're not spending enough, buddy. Print some more stuff, get out there and spend, and then the economy will be fine. And here's an interesting point, too, and in reading Krugman, yes, I actually read his stuff, what they're saying is that this spending is just filling a hole. It's temporary. We're getting this money out until the economy recovers. So in other words, it recovers. It's sort of this mysterious thing that recovers on its own. And so actually what Rothbard points out is that the boom is actually a period of wasteful misinvestment. It's a time when errors are made due to credit tampering with the free market. And that's what we've got now. Because we've had this expansion of credit, we've had the boom, ladies and gentlemen. We had our boom. I hope you enjoyed it. It's time to pay for it. And so now we're in that situation. In fact, when this thing is starting to, it's coming back to claim its own, and the government is desperately trying to keep these old orders, reflate them, keep the old orders going. When in fact the spending is still going to do it. I hadn't thought about that. Let me give you one example. If you've been to New Orleans, or the city formerly known as New Orleans, but although Walter is helping to restore it to its to its glory, you've got levee systems there, okay, and it pulls that Mississippi River, right along there, okay, and they got to have that Mississippi River in New Orleans because it is a port city. They actually do some work there, and whereas if you go back and you see where the Mississippi River used to go, if you go up a little farther up into what they call Louisiana, and what you have to understand, the Mississippi River wants to go elsewhere. And one of these days it's just going to go, and New Orleans, and then what?
Not if the federal government can help.
Precisely.
Millions and millions a year pouring concrete.
Yeah, and so
defy gravity.
Yeah, exactly. Defy gravity, and it's basically that same sort of thing. But it won't matter in New Orleans. They'll get their booze by truck, and they'll just, All right. Thank you very much.